Jeffrey Sachs reveals the hidden U.S. agenda for Africa. Welcome to Dark Faith, the channel where we uncover hidden truths from history, economics, and scripture to empower your understanding of the world. I'm your host, Kevin, and today we're diving into a powerful message that connects global politics, African struggles, and biblical prophecy in ways that will challenge everything you thought you knew. It begins with a stark warning from a Sudanese activist about impending destruction and war. Words that echo the insights of renowned economist Jeffrey Sachs and ancient prophecies. Let's explore this together, starting right now. Your country is at risk. What is coming to your nation is destruction and war. Those are not my words. Those are the words of a Sudanese activist warning Kenya about what is happening right now across Africa. And here is what will shock you. One of the world's most respected economists, Jeffrey Sachs, is saying the exact same thing. Why would a top economist from Columbia University risk his career and reputation to warn Black Americans and Africans about a specific threat coming from the United States? What does he know that you don't? And why does his warning match up perfectly with biblical prophecy written thousands of years ago? I am going to tell you something that will change how you see everything. The wars in Sudan, the chaos in Kenya, the destruction in Libya, these are not random tribal conflicts. These are not accidents of history. These appear to be planned operations, and Jeffrey Sachs has the receipts to support this view. By the time you finish this video, you will understand three things. You will see how U.S. foreign policy has been designed to dominate Africa through what Sachs calls unipolarity. You will discover why your tax dollars as a Black American fund the very system that keeps both you and Africa oppressed. And you will learn what the Bible said about this exact pattern of oppression and the liberation that is coming. This is not conspiracy theory. This is documented evidence from a world-renowned economist combined with biblical prophecy that anyone can verify. And if you are watching from Africa, or if you are a Black American, this message is especially for you. What I am about to share will connect dots you have never seen connected before. Let me be clear about what we are going to cover. First, I will show you exactly what Jeffrey Sachs revealed about U.S. strategy in Africa, and why he calls it unipolarity, the belief that America should dominate all global decisions. Second, you will see documented evidence of what is happening right now in Sudan, real-time proof that Sachs is right. Third, I will walk you through the biblical prophecies that predicted this exact system of oppression thousands of years before it happened. And fourth, I will show you the prophecies of liberation that are being fulfilled right now. As you watch this video, everything I share today is sourced. I will cite Sachs's own words. I will reference specific Bible verses you can look up yourself. I will show you current events that mainstream media barely covers. This is not speculation. This is evidence. And here is my promise to you. If you watch this entire video, you will never see U.S. foreign policy the same way again. You will never read the Bible the same way again. You will understand why Africa matters to Black Americans, and why Black Americans should care deeply about what is happening in Africa right now. You will see the system that has oppressed both communities for centuries, and you will learn what you can do about it. This is going to be uncomfortable. Truth usually is, but I would rather give you uncomfortable truth than comfortable lies. So pay attention. Take notes if you need to, and please watch all the way to the end, because the biblical connection I reveal in the final section will absolutely blow your mind. Building on this introduction, let me start by telling you who Jeffrey Sachs is and why you should listen to what he says, as his insights provide a foundation for understanding the broader issues at hand. Jeffrey Sachs is not some random internet personality making bold claims. This man is a professor at Columbia University, one of the most prestigious schools in America. He advised the United Nations for years. He worked with governments around the world on economic development. This is an establishment insider, someone who sat at the tables where decisions get made. And that is exactly why his warnings matter so much. When someone inside the system speaks out against the system, you need to pay attention. Sachs has spent recent years doing something that makes powerful people very uncomfortable. He has been exposing U.S. foreign policy for what it really is. Here is what Sachs says, drawing from his extensive analysis of global power dynamics. After the Cold War ended in 1991, the United States became the world's only superpower. And instead of using that power to lift up developing nations, instead of investing in cooperation and shared prosperity, the U.S. pursued what Sachs calls unipolarity. One nation dominating everyone else through military force and economic control. Listen to how Sachs describes it. For decades, the United States has operated as the world's leading superpower, a system many call unipolarity. But Sachs argues that this era is fading, and the world is shifting towards something new. And the powerful people who benefit from the current system do not want it to fade. They will do anything to maintain control, including tearing Africa apart. And in 2026, according to analyses from the Foreign Policy Research Institute and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Trump's America First policies have further accelerated this shift by slashing foreign aid budgets like USAID by up to 2/3 and imposing tariffs of 10 to 50% on African imports, impacting countries like Lesotho with 12,000 job losses in textiles, and South Africa facing 30% tariffs on automobiles. Do you see it? This not only sustains unipolarity, but heightens instability, pushing Africa toward alternatives like China and Russia. With Nigeria's BRICS expansion in January 2025, marking a turning point that could reshape global economics in 2027 if these trends persist. Sachs has documented how the U.S. treats any country that tries to stay neutral or independent as a threat. Neutrality is subversion. That is the phrase. If you are not with us, you are against us. And if you are against us, we will regime change you, sanction you, or destabilize you. Now, here is where it gets personal for Black Americans. As this global dynamic directly ties into domestic challenges that many face every day, Sachs connects the dots between what happens in Africa and what happens in your own community. He points out that when military budgets rise, social investment shrinks. This affects many American communities, but especially Black Americans, who have long faced underfunded schools, limited access to healthcare, economic inequality, unequal infrastructure investment. Let me say that again, so it sinks in. The same system that exploits Africa is the same system that keeps your neighborhood underfunded. The same priorities that put military spending over African development are the same priorities that put military spending over fixing schools in Baltimore, Detroit, or Atlanta. This is not coincidence. This is the same system working the same way on both sides of the Atlantic. Sachs is telling you something that church leaders often avoid, and that politicians definitely do not want you to understand. You and Africa are facing challenges tied to the same global system. A world order centered on military strength instead of education, health, or development. A global economy that benefits wealthy nations first and developing regions last. Inequality created by old systems that limit the political and economic power of Black communities worldwide. So when Sachs warns about what is coming to Africa, he is also warning about what is coming to Black American communities. Because the tighter the grip on global dominance, the less money and attention goes to addressing domestic inequality. You cannot have an empire abroad and justice at home. You have to choose. And America chose empire. But here is where the story gets even more interesting, as it bridges the gap between modern economics and ancient spiritual insights. Sachs is not just talking about economics and politics. Whether he realizes it or not, he is describing patterns that the Bible predicted thousands of years ago. Now hang on, because what I am about to show you will connect the secular economic analysis to ancient biblical prophecy in a way that will make the hair on your arm stand up. The Bible talks about something in Deuteronomy 28 that describes exactly what Sachs is warning about. Deuteronomy 28, starting at verse 64, says this: "The Lord will scatter you among all nations from one end of the earth to the other. There you will find no repose, no resting place. The Lord will give you an anxious mind, eyes weary with longing, and a despairing heart." Now I want you to think about that for a minute. A prophecy written over 3,000 years ago, describing scattering, no rest, anxious minds, weary eyes, despair. Does that not describe the African diaspora? Does that not describe the experience of being scattered across the world through slavery? Never finding full rest in foreign lands? Living with anxiety about your place in societies that never fully accept you? Eyes weary from looking for justice that never seems to come? This is not coincidence. This is prophecy being fulfilled. And here is the part that should make you sit up straight. The same biblical text that describes oppression also describes liberation. God does not just predict the suffering, he promises the breakthrough. There is a prophecy about Africa that says Africa shall carry the gospel the last mile. Think about what that means. Africa, the continent that has been exploited and dismissed and called uncivilized. Africa has a divine destiny to complete the work of spreading truth to the entire world. In fact, the Bible is full of African presence that most churches do not teach. Simon of Cyrene, an African man, helped Jesus carry the cross. The very symbol of Christianity was carried by African hands. The Ethiopian eunuch in the book of Acts was one of the first Gentile converts to Christianity. Africa is not an afterthought in biblical history. Africa is central. And here is why this matters right now. Prophecy is not just about the past. Prophecy is about recognizing patterns and understanding where we are in God's timeline. When you see a respected economist like Jeffrey Sachs warning about systems of domination, and when you see those warnings lining up perfectly with biblical descriptions of oppression, you are watching prophecy unfold in real time. Sachs describes unipolarity. The Bible describes kingdoms that rise through power and fall through pride. Sachs talks about economic exploitation of Africa. The Bible talks about nations that plunder others, eventually facing judgment. Sachs warns that the current system cannot hold. The Bible promises that oppressive systems always collapse. You are not just learning political science right now. You are learning prophetic patterns. And once you see these patterns, you cannot unsee them. Now, building on these prophetic insights, let me show you the evidence of what is happening right now as this connects the ancient warnings to today's realities. Because this is not theoretical. This is not ancient history. This is today. This is real people suffering from the exact system that Sachs warned about and the Bible predicted. Let me take you to Sudan. Most Americans could not find Sudan on a map if you gave them 3 tries. But what is happening in Sudan right now is one of the most important stories in the world, and almost nobody is talking about it. Here is what a Sudanese activist said recently. "I am from Sudan. I can tell you we have never expected that our country will be in such a destructive war. But the reality is, we have been in an unexpected high level of destruction caused by the United Arab Emirates for the last 2 years. Let that sink in. The United Arab Emirates, not even a Western country, acting as a proxy force to destabilize an African nation. And here is the kicker. It is all about resources. Sudan has gold. Sudan has strategic location. And forces that want to control those resources have turned Sudan into a war zone. The activist continues, "We have seen the actions of the UAE in Yemen. It destroyed the whole country. We have seen UAE actions in Libya and other countries. The UAE is not what you think it is. Now, here is where it gets really dark. There is a group called the RSF operating in Sudan. This group is funded by outside forces, and they are committing atrocities. The activist describes the RSF leader as someone who is on the blacklist of America, confirmed and wanted for mass destructions, targeted killings, and ethnic cleansing. Did you catch that? Ethnic cleansing, targeting people based on their African identity. The activist says the RSF leader thinks he is an Arab, and he thinks that he is superior to the Africans of the western side of Sudan. So, he is killing African descent and targeting them. This is genocide. This is not civil war. This is systematic elimination of African people, so that outside forces can control resources. And it is happening right now, while you watch this video. And in 2026, according to reports from the International Rescue Committee and Crisis Group, Sudan has surpassed 1,000 days of war, with over 150,000 lives lost, and 9.5 million people displaced within the country, making it one of the world's largest humanitarian crises. Let that sink in. If the current U.S. policies under Trump continue to cut aid and prioritize military spending, we can see this crisis escalate in 2027, with millions more refugees fleeing and the conflict spilling over into neighboring countries like Kenya, creating a domino effect of instability across the continent. But it does not stop in Sudan, as this pattern of resource-driven conflict extends to other nations in the region. Let me tell you what is happening in Kenya right now. Kenya has been relatively stable compared to some of its neighbors. But stability does not last when there are resources to exploit and leaders who can be bought. The same Sudanese activist issued a direct warning to the Kenyan people. You are at risk. Your country is at risk. You don't know what is coming, but what is coming to your country is destruction and war. Why would Kenya be at risk? Because Kenya's president is under pressure. The activist explains it clearly. Your President Ruto is under huge pressure by the United Arab Emirates. His hands are actually dirty. He was part of gold smuggling deals. Gold smuggling. Let me explain what that means. Gold gets mined in Sudan or other African countries, often in conflict zones where armed groups control the mines. That gold gets smuggled into Kenya. Then it gets sold to the world as Kenyan gold, as if it was mined legally in Kenya. The profits go to foreign powers and corrupt officials. The African people who live on the land get nothing except violence and poverty. The activist warns Kenyans directly. Mr. Ruto is engaged in gold smuggling operations that are illegal. They smuggle gold from Sudan. They bring it to Kenya, and then they resell it to the world. And because Ruto is compromised, because he has dirty deals to hide, he is being pressured to legitimize the RSF, the same genocidal group operating in Sudan. Think about what that means. A group committing ethnic cleansing in one country is about to be given legitimacy by a neighboring country, because that neighboring country's leader is being blackmailed over his corruption. This is how the system works. This is how Africa gets carved up. Not through direct colonialism like the old days, but through corruption, through proxy forces, through resource theft disguised as business deals. And here is the warning that should terrify Kenyans. UAE likes your gold, likes your country, likes the mining sector in your country. And soon if you don't act, UAE will take over your country. And if you resist, you are going to face a similar war, just like the Libyan people did, just as Sudanese people are doing now. And as of 2026, with the ongoing pressure from UAE and the spillover from Sudan's crisis, Kenya is facing increased risks of instability. According to reports from Human Rights Watch, where gold smuggling has escalated, potentially leading to broader regional conflicts in 2027 if international aid continues to be slashed under policies like those in the U.S. Libya. Remember Libya. In 2011, Western powers led a military intervention in Libya. Under the excuse of protecting civilians, they killed Muammar Gaddafi, the longtime leader. And what happened after that? Libya became a failed state. Slave markets returned to Libya. Actual slave markets, where African migrants are bought and sold. Infrastructure collapsed. Militias run wild. The country that once had the highest standard of living in Africa became a nightmare. And you know what Gaddafi was trying to do before they killed him? He was trying to create an African currency backed by gold that would allow African nations to trade without using the US dollar. He wanted African economic independence, and for that, he had to go. They called it humanitarian intervention, but it was regime change to protect financial dominance. The same pattern keeps happening. Chad, the Central African Republic. These countries are barely sovereign anymore. Their leaders are puppets. Their resources flow out. Their people suffer. Now let me tie this to Jeffrey Sachs's warning and make it crystal clear why he is risking so much to speak out, as his analysis provides the thread that connects these events. Sachs documented that after the 11th of September 2001, the United States decided to launch 7 wars in 5 years. 7 wars. That was not defensive strategy. That was offensive domination. Sachs cites General Wesley Clark, who was NATO's supreme commander, talking about this publicly. Clark went to the Pentagon on the 20th of September 2001, just 9 days after the attacks, and he was handed a paper explaining 7 wars, the targets, old Soviet allies, and supporters of groups that Israel wanted eliminated. This was not about American security. This was about regional domination and protecting the interests of allied powers. Sachs traces it back to a document called Clean Break from 1996, put together by Benjamin Netanyahu and his American political team. The goal was to end any idea of a two-state solution and establish total control. Now, what does this have to do with Africa? Everything. Because the same strategic thinking that produces 7 wars in the Middle East produces endless destabilization in Africa. Control the resources, control the trade routes, install friendly leaders, overthrow unfriendly ones, keep the region divided so it can never unify and challenge Western dominance. Sachs calls this unipolarity in action. The belief that one power can and should control the global order through military and economic force. And Africa is the final frontier. Africa has the resources that the modern world runs on. Cobalt for electric car batteries, rare earth minerals for smartphones and computers, gold, oil, diamonds, agricultural land. Whoever controls Africa controls the future economy. The Democratic Republic of Congo, the DRC, is one of the most resource-rich places on Earth. It has cobalt, copper, diamonds, gold, coltan for electronics, and it also has over 7 million internally displaced people. More than 7 million people driven from their homes by violence tied to mining and resource extraction. Women and children work in dangerous conditions with no health and safety regulations. Multinational corporations engage in environmental degradation, corruption, human rights violations. But when you read Western news, they call it tribal conflict. They call it African corruption. They never talk about the multinational corporations deliberately misreporting the value of imports and exports to reduce taxes. They never talk about the 68 billion taken out of Africa every year by foreign companies, while only 19 billion comes in as aid. They never talk about the 29 billion stolen annually through illegal logging, fishing, and wildlife trade. More money leaves Africa than enters it. Let me say that again. More money leaves Africa than enters it. Africa is not poor. Africa is being made poor. Africa is being robbed. And Jeffrey Sachs is one of the few establishment figures with the courage to say it out loud. He says that Africa often receives less investment than it needs because global institutions designed decades ago favor wealthy countries. He says developing goals are slowed by unequal access to resources. He says the current system prioritizes military power over economic development and cooperation. That is diplomatic language for what I am telling you more bluntly. The system is rigged. Africa is being exploited. And the same system that exploits Africa keeps black Americans poor because you cannot run an empire without sacrificing your own people. The money has to come from somewhere, and it comes from cutting social programs, underfunding schools, ignoring infrastructure in black neighborhoods, while spending trillions on overseas military bases and interventions. Sachs says it clearly. A country focused on global dominance cannot fully invest in solving its own domestic inequalities. When military budgets rise, social investment shrinks, especially for black Americans. So when you see Sudan burning, when you see Kenya being threatened, when you see the DRC torn apart by mining conflicts, you are not just seeing African problems. You are seeing the same system that keeps your community underfunded, operating on a global scale. You are seeing your tax dollars at work. You are paying for this. Now, to fully grasp why these patterns persist, I need to pause here and show you the historical context. Because none of this happened overnight. And understanding the roots will reveal how deeply entrenched the system is. This is decades in the making. This is a system that was deliberately constructed. And if you understand the history, you will understand exactly how we got here, and why it is so hard to break free. Let me take you back to 1945, right after World War II ended. The world was in ruins, Europe was destroyed, Japan was occupied, and two superpowers emerged from the rubble, the United States and the Soviet Union. For the next 46 years, these two powers would compete for global dominance in what we call the Cold War. But during that same time, something else was happening. African nations were gaining independence from European colonizers throughout the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s. Country after country in Africa declared independence. Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, dozens of nations. It was supposed to be liberation. It was supposed to be freedom. But independence on paper is not the same as independence in reality. Here is what most history classes do not teach you. At the exact moment African nations were gaining political independence, Western powers were creating economic institutions designed to maintain control. In 1944, before the war even ended, the United States and its allies met at a place called Bretton Woods and created the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. They sold this as helping developing nations. But here is the trick. These institutions were controlled by Western powers from day one. The voting structure gave the United States and Europe veto power. The policies they pushed favored Western economic interests, and any African country that wanted loans had to follow Western rules. So yes, African nations got flags and national anthems and seats at the United Nations. But economically, they were locked into a system designed by their former colonizers. This is what scholars call neo-colonialism. You do not need to occupy a country if you control its economy. You do not need governors and soldiers if you have debt and conditions. And during the Cold War, both the United States and Soviet Union used Africa as a chessboard. They would support different factions, arm different groups, back different leaders. It was never really about helping Africa develop. It was about preventing the other superpower from gaining influence. African nations were pawns in a game played by others. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank would offer loans to African countries, but the loans came with conditions called structural adjustment programs. These programs forced African governments to cut spending on healthcare and education, to privatize state-owned companies, to open their markets to foreign corporations. The result was that African economies were restructured to serve foreign interests, not local development. This promoted inequality. This perpetuated cycles of poverty. This reinforced unequal trade relationships. Western companies could come in and exploit natural resources and labor. They would underpay workers, extract resources, report false values to avoid taxes, and send the profits back home. And here is the part that gets suppressed. The media during this time praised everything. They talked about the triumph of democracy. They celebrated the New World Order. They never mentioned that this was just colonialism in a suit and tie. The propaganda worked so well that even many Africans believed the problem was their own corruption, their own failures, never the rigged system itself. This period from 1991 to 2001 set up everything that came after. It normalized American dominance. It established that the United States could dictate terms without consequences. It proved that Western powers could control Africa economically without needing colonies. And it taught American policymakers a dangerous lesson that overwhelming power allows you to do whatever you want. Then the 11th of September 2001 happened, and whatever restraints still existed completely disappeared. 9 days after the attacks, on the 20th of September 2001, the Pentagon created a plan for 7 wars in 5 years. Jeffrey Sachs documents this from General Wesley Clark, who was NATO's supreme commander. Clark went to the Pentagon and was handed a piece of paper listing 7 countries to be attacked. 7 wars, not defensive operations, regime change wars. The targets were old Soviet allies and any government supporting groups that Israel wanted eliminated. This was not about terrorism. This was about using the fear and anger after September 11th to reshape the entire Middle East and beyond. Sachs traces this back to a 1996 document called Clean Break, put together by Benjamin Netanyahu and his American advisors. The goal was to end any negotiated peace in the Middle East and establish dominance through force. What does this have to do with Africa? Everything. Because the same mentality that produces endless war in the Middle East produces endless destabilization in Africa. Once you decide that military intervention is the answer to every problem, once you decide that regime change is acceptable policy, you create a machine that never stops. During this era, from 2001 to 2022, United States military spending exploded. Trillions of dollars, multiple wars happening at the same time, bases in dozens of countries, drone programs, special operations, the machinery of dominance running at full speed. And what happened to domestic spending during the same time? It got cut. What happened to schools in black neighborhoods? Underfunded. What happened to health care access for black Americans? Limited. What happened to infrastructure in black communities? It crumbled, because you cannot have unlimited military spending and robust social programs. You have to choose. And America chose empire. Jeffrey Sachs saw this happening. He saw military budgets rise while social investment shrank. He saw the impact especially on black Americans who face underfunded schools, limited access to healthcare, economic inequality, unequal infrastructure investment. He started asking uncomfortable questions. Why are we spending trillions overseas while Americans suffer at home? In Africa, this era brought catastrophe after catastrophe. Libya. In 2011, Western powers led by the United States and NATO bombed Libya for months. They killed Muammar Gaddafi. They destroyed the government. And what happened after? Total collapse. Slave markets returned to Libya, where African migrants are bought and sold like animals. Militias took over. Infrastructure fell apart. The country with the highest standard of living in Africa became a failed state. And you know what Gaddafi was trying to do before they killed him? He was planning to create an African currency backed by gold. He wanted African nations to be able to trade with each other without using US dollars. He wanted African economic independence that could not be allowed. So they called it humanitarian intervention and regime changed him. South Sudan was another project. The narrative says South Sudan fought for independence from Sudan. But Sachs tells a different story. He says South Sudan did not defeat North Sudan in a tribal battle. It was a U.S. project. You would go to Nairobi and meet U.S. military personnel and senators with deep interests in Sudan's politics. This was not organic independence. This was geopolitical maneuvering to control oil resources and weaken an Arab government that was not playing ball with Western interests. Throughout this period, the same pattern repeated. Any African leader who pursued true independence got labeled a dictator and faced Western intervention. Any African country with valuable resources experienced civil war or tribal conflict, always with foreign fingers in the background. Any attempt at Pan-African unity got disrupted by division and instability. And back in the United States, black communities kept getting poorer relative to white communities. The wealth gap increased. The incarceration gap increased. The education gap increased, because the money that could have addressed these problems was being spent on endless wars and maintaining global dominance. Sachs watched all this and came to a realization. It did not matter who was president. Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump. They all continued the same trajectory because this was not about party politics. This was about a permanent system, a deep state, a military-industrial complex, a set of institutions and interests that transcended elections. The system worked the same way regardless of who was in the White House. Prioritize military dominance, protect corporate access to resources, maintain dollar hegemony, control global institutions, suppress any challenge to American power. That was the bipartisan consensus from 2001 to 2020. But something started shifting around 2020. New powers began to rise. China's economy grew massive. India emerged as a major force. African nations started making deals with China instead of just accepting Western terms. Latin America and Southeast Asia began asserting more independence. The world started moving away from unipolarity toward multipolarity, and that terrified the people who benefit from the current system. Because if the United States is not the sole superpower anymore, if other nations have real alternatives, then American leverage disappears. You cannot dictate terms if people can just walk away and make deals with someone else. That is why Sudan is exploding right now. That is why Kenya is being threatened. That is why you see increasing intervention and instability across Africa. The scramble for Africa never ended. And as American global power weakens, the desperation to maintain control intensifies. The United Arab Emirates is acting as a proxy. They fund the RSF in Sudan. They pressure leaders like Ruto in Kenya. They operate with Western blessing because they do the dirty work that American and European governments cannot do as openly anymore. The UAE thinks they are the superheroes of mining in the world. Now they want African gold, African cobalt, African resources. And if Africans resist, they face war. More than 7 million people have been displaced in the Democratic Republic of Congo due to mining conflicts. Over 358,000 displaced just since 2024. Women and children work in dangerous conditions with no health and safety regulations so that people in America and Europe can have smartphones and electric cars. Murder, displacement, poverty, sexual assault. These are the costs of the resources the West consumes. They report on violence in Africa as if it is random, as if it is just Africans being violent. They never talk about the multinational corporations operating with impunity. They never mention the 68 billion extracted from Africa every year. While only 19 billion comes in as aid, they never discuss the 29 billion stolen through illegal logging, fishing, and wildlife trade. More money leaves Africa than enters it. Africa is not poor. Africa is being made poor. Africa is being robbed. And it has been happening for decades under different names. Colonialism, neocolonialism, structural adjustment, free trade, development. The words change, but the theft continues. Now, to illustrate who gains from this ongoing cycle and the devastating effects it has, let me show you who benefits from this system and what the consequences are. Because once you see this clearly, you will understand why everything is the way it is. Follow the money. That is what Jeffrey Sachs taught us to do. When narrative changes, When policy shifts, when interventions happen, ask yourself one question: who benefits? Let me tell you exactly who benefits from the current system. Western multinational corporations that extract African resources, they are making billions. Mining companies getting cobalt and copper and diamonds from the Congo. Oil companies taking petroleum from Nigeria and Angola. Agricultural companies controlling vast farmland while locals go hungry. These corporations profit massively from the status quo. The evidence is undeniable. $68 billion taken out of Africa every year by foreign companies, while only $19 billion comes in as aid. Think about that ratio. For every dollar of aid, more than $3 flow out as profit. That is not development. That is extraction. Political leaders in the West benefit too. They can campaign on being strong on foreign policy. They can justify massive military budgets by pointing to threats everywhere. And the military-industrial complex benefits enormously. Defense contractors make billions from endless interventions. Every war is profit for someone. Financial institutions benefit. The IMF and World Bank charge interest on loans that trap African countries in permanent debt. It is a system designed to never be paid off. Now ask yourself this question: when did the narrative about Africa change from colonialism is evil to we are helping develop Africa? When did exploitation become aid? Who benefited from that narrative shift? The uncomfortable answer is the same people who benefited from colonialism, the same extraction, the same resource theft, the same profits flowing from Africa to the West. They just changed the language. They put on suits instead of military uniforms. They sent bankers instead of governors. But the result is identical. Look at the pattern with African leaders. The ones who cooperate with Western powers get support. They get loans. They get favorable media coverage. They stay in power for decades, even if they are corrupt. But the leaders who resist, the ones who try to pursue true independence, they get labeled dictators. They face sanctions. They get regime changed. Muammar Gaddafi planned an African currency independent of the dollar. Then he got killed and Libya collapsed. That is not coincidence. That is cause and effect. Any African leader proposing real independence faces Western intervention. Now let me connect this to Black Americans, because this is where it gets personal. Linking the global exploitation to the everyday struggles within your own communities. When the United States increases military spending, where does that money come from? It comes from cutting domestic programs. It comes from underfunding schools. It comes from limiting healthcare access. It comes from ignoring infrastructure. And which American communities suffer most from these cuts? Black communities. Underfunded schools, disproportionately in black neighborhoods. Limited healthcare access hitting Black Americans hardest. Economic inequality growing wider. Infrastructure crumbling in black areas. While new military bases get built overseas, your tax dollars as a Black American fund the system exploiting Africa. Let that sink in. You work, you pay taxes, and that money funds military operations and economic domination of the continent your ancestors came from. You are being forced to pay for the oppression of your own heritage. The cycle works like this. Exploit Africa. Profits flow to Western corporations. Black Americans pay taxes. That tax money funds more military to maintain the exploitation. Around and around, you are trapped in a system that uses your money against you and against Africa simultaneously. The people making these decisions, they benefit from keeping Black Americans and Africans separate. If you ever united, if you ever recognized the common oppressor, if you ever organized across the Atlantic, that would threaten the entire system. So they keep you divided. They tell Black Americans that Africa is backward and primitive. They tell Africans that Black Americans abandon their roots. They create psychological distance, so you never build solidarity. Now let me show you the consequences of all this, because the human cost is staggering. Revealing how these patterns affect real lives on both sides of the ocean. In Sudan right now, People are experiencing unexpected levels of destruction. Families displaced, homes destroyed, ethnic cleansing happening. The activists said it clearly. We never thought the UAE would do this to us until it became reality. That is what modern warfare looks like. Foreign powers funding local militias to create chaos while they control resources. In the Democratic Republic of Congo, over 7 million people have been internally displaced. 7 million? That is more than the population of many countries. And why? Mining conflicts, competing forces trying to control cobalt, copper, coltan for electronics. Women and children forced to work in dangerous conditions with no safety regulations. People dying so Westerners can have smartphones. Libya went from the highest standard of living in Africa to having active slave markets, actual human beings being bought and sold in 2025. How does that happen? Regime change and total collapse of order. They destroyed the government, destabilized the country, and slavery returned. The environmental devastation is massive. Unregulated mining destroys land. Illegal logging strips forests. Pollution poisons water. And who suffers? The African people living there, while the profits go elsewhere. Economic consequences trap entire generations. Africa stays poor, despite having the richest resources on Earth. Why? Because the wealth gets extracted. African children mine cobalt instead of going to school. Educated Africans flee to the West because opportunities are destroyed at home. Brain drain, talent loss, potential wasted. Cultural erosion happens when Western institutions replace traditional African governance. When IMF policies are forced on countries, they destroy local decision-making. When Western media dominates, it shapes how Africans see themselves.